So, more about exhibitions today. On Monday, we sort of took a bit of a side excursion to talk about the book that Jane is writing, which has a little bit more politics going on than she really wanted to talk about. You know, who the market really is, the whole 250th celebration, which will be officially announced, I think, Monday. And looking for projects to do, by the way, if anybody wants money to do projects connected to Brown's history. That whether it's about looking back or looking forward is a hot topic, and who actually should run that is a hot topic. Is it run out of the provost's office, where Jane's book is? Is it run out of the alumni office, which has a lot of interest in taking it over? Or is it run out of the development office, which would love to turn it into the next capital campaign? It's a really interesting question. So that is up in the air right now. It looks to me like it's going to be more run out of the development office than people had originally thought, but maybe that's no surprise. But next week there'll be a big announcement, and you'll see the new logo and the new motto for it, and I'll be curious on any feedback on that whole project. So anyway, exhibits, what makes for a good exhibit, and then mostly thinking about words in exhibits. It's really, really hard to describe what makes for a good exhibit. I think that's one of the things to keep in mind. There are two very good documents out there that have been written up about how to evaluate exhibitions. The National Association for Museum Exhibition, or NAME, has this list of 7 categories. And I'll just read these briefly, and then show you some pictures using the other set of categories. But the first one is sort of the bottom line in exhibitions. No matter what you might think about your exhibition, about how beautiful it is, how lovely it is, how wonderfully it's written, if the audience doesn't respond in the way you want them to do it, it's sort of pointless. You know, it's a success if you reach the audience you're trying to reach. So just something to keep in mind. It's very easy to forget that when you're working on exhibitions, because the audience is never there, unless you do a lot of evaluation up front. But did the audience respond to the exhibition? Content, did they understand the whole thing? Did they learn things? Then some more, a more narrowly defined topic. There are lots of people in museums whose first goal is to take good care of the collections. So were your collections taken care of when they were on exhibit? You know, did they have security? Did they have the right temperatures and humidities? And did they have, you know, there was no off-gassing from the cases you built? Oh, there's a million technical details of conservation that you take into account when you're doing exhibits. And then the other parts of this is the information clear, coherent. I love the last line of that statement. Is there a good reason? Why not? Do you want to confuse people in your exhibit? It's not easy to imagine exactly what kind of exhibit the ideal is to confuse people when they're done, but you could imagine one, yeah.
Conflicted maybe.
So you could want people to come away saying, boy, this is a lot more complicated than I thought, and I'm not really sure what to think. It's pretty rare. You can imagine some art shows that are designed to be just lots of experience and no clear communication message. But anyway, it's worth thinking about. If you have a good reason, perfectly fine. Are the media used appropriate to the stories you're trying to tell? In doing exhibits, there's always this temptation to take anything that's difficult or complicated and say, oh, we'll make a video out of that, because you can tell certain kinds of stories with videos. And that's not all wrong, but it's something to keep in mind, that it's often thinking about the right technique for each of the stories you're trying to tell is important. And finally, the last one on this list is just, are people comfortable? if they're not comfortable, they're not going to learn very much. So that's oftentimes the first thing that you want to think about. The other system of measurement that is out there is called the Excellent Judges Program. And this is actually there's a whole brochure of how to judge exhibits to see whether they're any good. You can find this online, and the materials will be in the notes of where to find it all. So they have a whole series of categories, well, four categories. They start off with comfortable. Physically, psychologically, can they find the bathroom when they need it? Do they get lost in the exhibit? Exhibit designers will often tell you, this is the first thing to worry about. Worry about everything else after that.
But how does this gel with the zone of proximal development thing, where it's like you have to be a little bit uncomfortable, and that's actually the best zone for learning?
Okay, uncomfortable in a psychic or mental way. This
like
is
at
more
the edge of your
right.
knowing.
Okay, so when this means comfortable, I think what they're really after is they're not upset. They're not wondering where the exit is. They're not wondering whether they can get lunch in the museum. You're right, though. There is that argument that you want to be pushed a little bit to your limits at the same time.
I wonder if it has to do with safety.
There's some sense of safety in there. If there's a topic that makes you too nervous, you're thinking, or?
I'm just thinking about these aspects of comfort being more about safety, like bodily safety, and that being different.
Like if it's too loud and like
right.
kind of attacking you or in some way.
Yeah. Right. I think that's all things to keep in mind. Again, in some cases, that's what you want. In some cases, you want people to be pushed to the limit, but it's great to keep in mind. I thought I would just show you some pictures of exhibits to measure in terms of comfort, or are these comfortable? This is a picture from the Indiana State Museum, which is a huge museum. Does this strike you as comfortable?
Your neck would hurt.
Not particularly.
It's loaded with objects, which
Looks like Sam's Club.
It looks like Sam's Club. It does actually.
They think they're gonna fall on you.
Yeah.
It's very busy. This is a museum. It's worth a visit. Indiana has the best museums of any state. There's more money for museums in Indiana than any place else, and it's packed full of stuff. And it's done by Applebaum, one of the best exhibit design firms but he loves to pack stuff in there. Doesn't strike me as comfortable. Seems a little bit scary. The exhibit we did here, we tried really hard to be comfortable. Having a place for people to sit down is real important in an exhibition. This is an exhibit on modernist journals at the Carriage House Gallery. Again, give room aside to let people be comfortable. It's so tempting to take all of your space and just push your message as hard as you can. Show them as much as you possibly can. And that often appeals to the curator and a very few people who have similar interests, but often not to your audience. Give them a chance to sit down. This is the American Stories exhibit, just opened at the American History Museum. A little bit hard to tell in the dark picture, but comfort, not comfort.
Looks reasonably comfortable.
It's part of the challenge of a big museum. It's designed for lots of people to go through, which is something hard to design to sometimes. Yes?
Was it that dark in person?
No, it was pretty dark, but the side's a little bit darker. One of the questions, again, objects, you're always balancing these things. Objects like to be in the dark. It's good for objects to be in the dark. People like to be have light so they can see where they're going. That makes them comfortable. Designers like dark spaces around objects and bright spaces, bright lights on objects because it's more dramatic. Those are three things that you can't balance them all at the same time. You can't do them all at the same time. So this one actually struck me as, partly because when I was there it was so crowded, it was not very comfortable. But again, it was designed for big crowds, so it's hard to do that. Yeah.
Something else that I hadn't thought about before, but I had a colleague that taught me about it, was color accessibility, which basically, there's a surprising number of people that are colorblind,
Yep.
and so it's important to not only just have contrast in color, but also contrast in value, so darks and lights.
Yeah.
So that purple and yellow is actually pretty good because the yellow is quite light and purple's quite dark, but, well, is it? Oh, I guess it is.
Speaking of which.
In any case,
Probably blue.
So it's,
Yeah.
That's sort of a weird comfort
Yeah,
thing
no,
that I hadn't thought about.
Yeah, there's accessibility guidelines that I will post those. The Smithsonian has them on their website, which basically the number of people who have a hard time seeing contrast is very high. In fact, you really want black on white. You don't want white on black because it vibrates. There's a lot of rules that a good designer will know. Designers often fight against these because it makes for rather ugly exhibitions to follow them all the way. So there's some balancing act that goes on there. But Smithsonian exhibitions are all reviewed by accessibility folks who will be pretty clear about type size and number of words and colors and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Because this is something I just think about a lot as well. I mean, in terms of like other forms of access, like wheelchair access or kind of blind, deaf community, all that kind of stuff. How does that fit into all this?
This one looks like it would be pretty good for wheelchairs if you look at the heights of all the smaller text labels, and also they're not like angled like this, which is harder to read when you're sitting. They're kind of angled this way, which is something that we've started playing around with at the museum.
This will be a good. Smithsonian in general is very clear about this. There's an accessibility coordinator who evaluates every exhibit before it's done. The issues of intellectual accessibility are sometimes more challenging, but the heights are all good. The new thing that I've just realized is that the bifocal accessibility is actually a huge issue in museums. People with bifocals cannot see half of the exhibit labels in museums.
Wow.
They're the wrong height. So anyway, that's what happens. When you get old, you'll see that's a problem too. Naval Academy Museum, comfortable, feel welcoming. It's hard to tell, and the pictures are darker than
What's
I'd
in
like.
the front right there?
This is this is designed to feel like you're inside of a ship. This is sort of the interior of a ship. Those are mannequins. The whole place is full of mannequins that are life-size, sort of doing things in the space that you're in, which I think is designed to make you feel like you're sort of part of the show and comfortable. Don't know whether it works or not. One of the things that people look at all the time is waiting in lines and places to sit. There's actually a whole blog that I just discovered looking for these images about comfort in museums, which I'll give the address. The pictures on the left are the Museum of Modern Art, where you'll notice what everybody's doing. They're sitting down and they're texting. They're sitting down and they're looking at their digital devices. Providing a space to do that now has become clearly very important. It's when people feel comfortable when they can do that. Line on the pictures on the right there are lines at the new California Academy of Sciences, which apparently is famously uncomfortable place to be, the new buildings. Disney is really good about thinking about comfort. Even when you're waiting in line, they have it figured out. Museums are not. So again, just the whole way of thinking about it. I think, and this is my own, you recognize this place, yes.
Yeah.
So this is a museum shop. Museum shops are often the most comfortable places in museums because they want you to buy things. The place where people feel most comfortable around new things and about learning about things is actually department stores, I'm convinced. Because you can hold stuff, you can play with it, you can feel, they go out of the way they sell stuff is by making you feel like it's a comfortable place to buy things. And there's a lot that museums can learn about comfort from what goes on in the shop and from what goes on at in a store. You don't want to quite go all that far, but this kind of display you would never see in a museum exhibit. You know right away that it's a shop. But in fact, people spend more time here than they do in the exhibit. Looks like a very nice store.
Yeah. They've been selling so many more glass pieces now after installing this.
Okay. So there's a whole world out there of store design that can be useful. The next category in this again, everybody has their own sets of categories. Engaging. This is a word you've heard me talk about a lot. It's my favorite word. So it's interesting. It caught your attention. It was pleasurable. It was encouraging of social behaviors. Very important. Range of experiences. Interesting. All those kinds of words. Engaging. Yes or no? This is transportation exhibit at the Smithsonian. There's a TV here showing things. There's mannequins both inside and outside the railing. Sound.
They have like a visitor mannequin?
Yes. all we broke all of the walls with mannequins out. So the mannequins are sort of in the exhibit space, in the visitor space as well as the exhibit space.
That's really cool.
So it's hard to be engaging in quite the same way in a great big exhibit where you have lots of visitors, you have to design for it, you need railings and all. But breaking down some of those lines is one way to be engaging. How about, this is, it's not a very, it looks great on my screen. This is the front of a airplane. Big space full of airplanes. Engaging.
If you're
Nodding
super
his
into
head.
airplanes,
Some people, yeah.
if you're super into airplanes, then you kind of already know what you're looking for.
I think it's big and impressive.
It's big and impressive. One of the things that's so interesting is one of the other words is meaningful, that people talk about a lot. Objects turn out to be really meaningful. Objects are engaging sort of by themselves. If you look at the studies that are done, this kind of space, it's just sort of amazing to see. And so that's a different kind of engagement. It's not maybe an intellectual engagement, but walking through that space, it's overwhelming, maybe engaging. Any thoughts? This is more Indiana Museum. So this is when exhibit designers and educators talk about engaging, they often mean this kind of thing, which is interactive. Physical interactives. You pull open the drawers. You push the lever. And certainly for a certain part of your audience, that's real important. There's all kinds of language that goes around that about you want big motions, small motions for different people. Lots of ways to think about this kind of engagement. How about this rather old-fashioned looking thing? Engaging or no?
I like it.
Yeah, a lot of the old-fashioned things. This is the old California Academy of Sciences, which apparently many people feel very fondly about. They hate that they went to all this new modern video stuff. And before they just had these, just great pictures. You go and look at stuff. I don't know about this one. I think it may very much vary, maybe a generational thing. But it's not, engaging does not necessarily mean high tech. I guess maybe that's one of the messages.
They're very visually striking images.
Yeah.
For a timeline, timelines usually are very kind of hard to do in an interesting way, I think. But that's, I mean, if you're going to do a timeline, that's how you do it.
Yeah. And it's also taking advantage of a rather odd space. It must be a 30-foot high space they need to fill. And so putting 10-foot high pictures at the top, why not?
It almost has that same impression that you get when you see like large airplanes. Like there's something about seeing things like so large scale that makes them pretty incredible.
And they're also really good photographs, which might make a difference. Anyway, these are all things to balance. So reinforcing is another word that the excellent judges like to use. That it makes you feel like you know what you're doing. It's not too hard. It's not too easy. Going back to the notion of flow. That makes visitors confident in what they're doing. There's nothing here that talks directly about social engagement, social interactions, but that would be a part of it as well. That you can talk to each small group and go through and make sense out of it together. So how about under the category of reinforcing. Any sense of this kind of exhibit?
What is that?
I'm afraid it's a little bit tricky. This is more Indianapolis Museum. It's, I believe it's the story of settlement, and it's sort of the story of settlement told in 5 different ways, using 5 different techniques. There's objects, there's video, there's images. My picture doesn't make it clear, but my hope was to say, telling similar stories in a way that overlap, but different media, different approaches is one way of dealing with that reinforcing. Another one, maybe less so, the line between that and just overwhelming. Too much reinforcing is a hard one. Again, back to the Indianapolis Museum. They were clearly told, put a lot of stuff out on exhibit. And that maybe is not reinforcing in that way. And then meaningful. Personally relevant. Find themselves changed in a lasting way. So it turns out there's a new study that was just done by a group called Reach Associates, which is a big museum research firm. And here's what they say, according to their studies, make a museum experience meaningful. And it's not completely clear to me how they collected this data. They talked to 40,000, they got 40,000 replies to their survey, 4,000 of whom listed an experience in a museum that was meaningful and said what it was. So this is based on a very self-selected group. But by far, 75% of things that people remember, this is not in the museum but afterwards, are about original objects. And that should make museum people very happy. Turns out people go to museums to just see things. That's 75%. The rest of it, category 5 and 6% are things like programs and lectures and all the other things that go on museums. Connections to content, information learned, hands-on experience are meaningful, but connecting to original objects, according to this study, which is brand new. This is you can see the sorts of numbers. There's large numbers of people from lots of different kinds of museums, and almost without fail, the original objects were the things that people liked, which is sort of interesting. So, meaningful. It's completely outside of everyone's experience, but everyone seems to love it. Lots of original objects. That's the Wagner Free Institute of Science. I would really like to know whether visitors find it meaningful or just weird. I'm just not sure how to measure that. But they certainly do love the place. And then, of course, your basic art museum, you just have lots of art on the walls. That apparently is in the same category. The thing that's sort of interesting, this is an exhibit that's trying very, very hard to be meaningful. And that's the whole label. I cut it in half so it's a little bit easier to see. The Paul Cuffey was an African-American, Native American resident of Westport, Massachusetts, not too far from the New Bedford Whaling Museum where this exhibit is. They have a room that's claimed to be his kitchen. He's a really interesting character. He sets up the first free school. He talks about if he can't pay, he won't pay taxes if he isn't allowed to vote. Mm-hmm. And so they've set this room up, which had always been talked about as an 18th century kitchen, into a place to talk about race, contemporary issues, and talk about Paul Cuffey as an early African American leader, and done almost all aimed at kids, done with lots of kids talking in the space. There's the bottom half of it. Listen and ponder the questions and stories you'll hear. Lots of kids' conversations going on in the space with audio. Some of you have seen this.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on whether it's meaningful?
You were saying that there were kids' voices. I mean, Lauren and I sat in there together the other day, and there was, I didn't hear any kids' voices. It was like very much a narrator speaking about the historical background. And it said that there were pictures drawn by Paul Cuffey's students here in Providence,
Right.
and I also couldn't find those.
Yeah, I couldn't find
Oh.
those either.
There's that section where like the students' voices would come in and it would change voices, and then you're like, oh, this made me think of this.
Yeah,
And
that's what I was
what do you
thinking.
think of this? They like either ask questions or they like say they're of different opinions. I thought that was pretty effective. It takes a while. You have to listen to the narrative for a while before those sort of questions kick in. But I thought it was pretty interesting, and it's a nice, like the mechanics of it are interesting. It's like a little fireplace that has a projector over it, and it's projecting like different words that kind of help you
Yeah.
stay connected to what you're listening to, like just little clips and phrases. But it's kind of nice just sitting around the fire listening to this thing.
This is it's an interesting exercise. I don't know whether it's successful or not, but it's trying very hard to be relevant and maybe meaningful. Maybe done too much on the cheap, which that museum tends to do. But it's an interesting idea to take historical issues, try to make them meaningful to the present day. So I think it falls in that category as meaningful, but I'm not sure. And then just to review, the comfort, engagement, reinforcement, meaningfulness. The design here is that these are categories that you can use to go and look at exhibits. This is not so much as a visitor would carry these around. But as you think about whether an exhibit works, these are good categories to use. It's hard to sum up what makes a good exhibit. I think it's, again, an art, not a science. There's lots of surveys that are done. There's lots of questions that are asked, but even so, it's very much a work in progress. This kind of question helps you get at it, helps you think about it, but still not quite well. So I'm going to move on from exhibits to one narrower piece of it, which is the words in exhibits. And this is what we'll end up playing with some more on Friday as well. So how do you, what makes for a good label? Good label, I guess, is one that people read and learn from and remember, which is a pretty high standard to ask of labels. These are some of the things that make labels seem successful. It's part of a story, it's part of an overall whole. It's sort of, you know what you're about to get. Details, but not too many details, the right details. Meet your visitors where they are. It's so tempting to say your visitors should meet you where you are, but you're there to please them. They're the one paying admission. How to break things down is important. You can't put everything into one label. Anecdotes can work. Statistics, in my experience, are tempting but don't always work. Yep.
We actually read a study that the RISD Museum has in their file about writing labels. That was, I think, done at the, where was it?
Oh yeah, where was that?
Minnesota?
Yes.
Oh, was
Yeah,
it
okay.
in Minnesota?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
It was the.
They've done the most work on
and
this.
yeah.
Minnesota Institute of Art.
Yes, that's right. And they actually
Oh,
said
yeah,
that
it
one
was
of the things
really
that visitors hated was rhetorical questions.
This is a hot topic.
Yes.
Many museum educators will say it's always good to end with a question to get people conversing about things. I have not seen that particular piece of it. So this sort of thing tends to be good. The sort of thing that tends to be bad is vocabulary and sentence structures that are difficult. My thing about active voice is so important. Short sentences are important. Words that people can understand. Clear sentence structure. Remember, you're reading these things standing up, walking through. You're in a social situation. And then this wonderful line, too wordy, too worthy, or too woolly to do their job of communicating. Anyway, the sites for all these are in the post. But well, another example. So this is from that Minneapolis Institute of Art study. So, you think about audience to be reached. You think about what you're trying to do. These are some pretty basic rules. You can't assume that your readers, your visitors, are experts like you are. Museum people, art museum people love the notion that your labels are really just there to guide people to look at the art. History, anthropology museum labels tend to be more about having to explain things. Answering the visitors' most pressing questions is, well, I guess a good idea, but of course you want your visitors to answer, to know things you think are pressing too. The connection with the objects is real important. Labels don't exist on their own. They exist in a design next to objects oftentimes. How that relationship works, how that design works is real important. And I'll show you some pictures of good examples of that. Active voice, short paragraphs, short sentences, short words. These are all things we'll try to experiment with on Friday when we write some labels. And these are really short. 50 words is a short sentence, or 2 or 3 short sentences. These are all good things to keep in mind. Again, you don't need to write it all down. It's in the notes. Voice, something I'm most interested in is how do you get beyond the curator's voice? More and more the notion of letting the visitors have a voice with sticky notes or whatever it might be. Lots of different voices. Labels also don't exist on their own. They're all about being a system, a typology of labels. Lots of disagreement about how many different types there should be. There's a title label for the title of the show. There's a section label for the 3 or 4 sections in a show. Should there then be lots of group labels? Are there 10 categories? Are there 4 categories? Designers always like to push for fewer types. Curators always like to push for more types and more exceptions to them. My impression is that as long as it's sort of coherent, as long as you sort of know what to expect, the system, the project will work fairly well. The exhibit will work fairly well. Here's another set of examples, more from Minneapolis. So this is the Minneapolis Institute of Art has extremely strict rules about everything, as far as I can tell. This is the way every exhibit has to be. I don't know if they're still doing it or not, but it's really clear. You've got 10 words to say American art, 1900 to 2000. And American art was blah, 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 10 words. Main label, 150 words. 3 or 4 objects together, 150 words. What's called a tombstone labels in art museums. And then maybe you could discuss it and explain it in 100 to 150 words. This is pretty short. The RISD Museum probably has double this or triple this in most of its labels.
They're trying to shrink it, though.
They are. This is the wave of the future. But it's really hard to do. And what we'll do on Friday is I will give you a long label and ask you to turn it into a 100-word label. In fact, I will send some of those out before class to give you a chance to think about it. There's also a lot of process that goes on here. And I haven't talked all that much about process, but this is, again, Minneapolis Institute of Art, where there's curators, there's a writer, there's an editor, there's a designer. That's 4 people. Some places you would have other folks in there as well. They also have it set up where the curator writes the first draft, or the first thing is that the draft is written. Oftentimes, the designer will do the labels layout first and say, here, you've got this, make it fit. And then one of the things that writers or curators are supposed to do is fit to the exhibit design. to the point of saying, well, sorry, go back and take out a word of that line because it doesn't look good with the line break. So you learn to work for editors. Just some examples. I showed you this a little bit on Monday. This is the Borowski's 100-word story label. Not everybody likes this. This is good for history museums where you have a story arc in a label. You start with a hook, and then you get people to find out how it ended out. Some of those examples I already showed about the teaching history through stories, another example of that. But I thought what we'd spend the next few minutes looking at are some good labels. And think about what makes them successful. So it's, I'll up front, these are all labels. There's an annual competition for the best label writing. And these are the winners from last year, some of them. They tend to be won mostly by zoos because zoos are really good at this and they have fun stuff to show. And animals are cute and they aim at kids. So this is, I forget what zoo this is. But what would you say about this?
I think it's a great label.
What makes it a great label?
Because it tells, I mean, it uses, I don't know if this is a pre-existing poem or if they made it or something.
I think they wrote it.
But it uses a poetic form that's short and easy to read that children can read. It's sort of in the form of a children's book in some ways, but it does tell you about the fishing cat and what it does, that it somehow eats, minnows and likes water and hunts for its dinner in the water or whatever.
So what does the actual form of the poem tell you about?
That it's for kids.
Yeah, but I'm thinking more of the
What it eats.
what it tells you what it eats. So it gives you a bunch of facts. It's perfectly good. But just thinking about, read the poem and what kind of feeling do you get?
You get the sense of the cat waiting for quite a long time.
Yeah, that's what I think is just amazing about this. I mean, you get the sense that this cat's sitting there for a long time waiting for a minnow. It doesn't say that it takes a long time, but you can't read that without thinking that it's a long, slow time.
And it feels very action-driven because you have that endpoint where you can see it happening.
Right. So if anybody wants to write poems for the labels that we work on, I'd love to see it. It's really hard to do. But anyway, this is very nice. And then they always have this sort of, the other thing about zoos is that they pretty much know what they want to say. This is I'm sure a standard thing in every class. And then there's always some happen. But anyway, that one I think is just gorgeous. The other thing is it works very nicely as a design. This is not just words on a page. This is a design. All right. Take a moment to read that one. This is the DuSable Museum in Chicago. So who's the audience?
Everyone?
Youngish people?
What's that?
Young,
Middle
like
school.
middle
This
school.
is, this is probably kids' label.
Sounds like local audiences in university.
Yeah, I think
Is it
that's
better to
good.
have a rhetorical question or a real question? Because, yeah, we get it. That is a good place to build something because a lot of people are there.
Well, it makes it
Because
very...
that doesn't provoke discussion. It just, you just say, yeah,
Yeah,
what
I
better
don't,
place?
yeah, I don't think this it provokes discussion particularly.
But I think that's it's really actually communicating more information, right?
I guess.
Yeah.
It is. It's telling you that it is a good place to do this.
But
To
when you
start a
put,
farmer
is there a
training
better
course.
way to do that instead of like putting it in the form of a question that gives the reader a sense that they're about to like answer a question?
Right. I think this might be better if you had said, if they had said, what a great place to build.
Right.
They're trying to be a little bit, they're trying to be engaging and pull people in. It does, that might actually be confusing for kids too. I mean, 'cause maybe I'm supposed to think of a better place. So that one I'm not sure about. The thing that strikes me is they're spending a lot of time defining the word crossroads here. And I wonder if that's really what they want people to know. Instead, you know, basically up the first half of the label, if they had just started early Chicago sat at a crossroads of mighty rivers, would that have been enough? I think above, maybe middle school, high school, you may not need to define that. But on the other hand, it doesn't, this engages you. This is sort of honking and hurrying, and this is your street, State Street, it's local.
I think they're trying to relate the current situation in Chicago physically to how it was in that time, so that like if you live in the city and you know it as a city, they're trying to reestablish the river and the lake as the defining features at the time.
But couldn't you
Right now.
But couldn't you say, like, you know, early Chicago sat at a crossroads of mighty rivers, and then say, unlike the crossroads of today, where, you know, they're filled with cars, etc., etc. Right? So that you get to the idea, the core idea of the panel, like, immediately.
I think a lot could have been communicated with images here. I really
Yeah.
wish there was an image you could have a picture of old Chicago and the river and maybe a crosswalk if you want to compare them. I don't know if this was like near images or objects, but it's definitely calling out for something visual.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
Those fun facts, like I get that it's related and that like people traveled in canoes, but
Yeah. It's not that fun.
It's
like they were used to drag out the water down to a riverbank. I don't really know.
That's not going to make me go, wow!
Yeah,
And I wish I lived in these cities time.
In some ways,
because
it's
the
one of
future.
one of the challenges is to get especially little kids back in time and say things were different then. And so maybe that's what that first part does. You're in the busy hunking city right now. You're back then it was different, and here's in a way that it was different. That was interesting and useful.
Kind of confusing language. I feel like it could have been a little more.
Yeah, I agree. This one is not nearly as nice as the Fisher Cat poem. But anyway, very different kind of exhibit. Notice these are all very short. So keep that in mind.
I don't like when art labels tell you, like, what if you don't think that? I don't know, I feel like it's too imposing of an idea.
Okay, that's
Telling you that it's eerie.
Yeah,
This is
like,
eerie.
yeah, or like that, those things heighten the effect when you could have an opposite reaction to it.
It's more about, like, pointing out the sort of the things that will lead to an interpretation than actually superimposing, like, a full theme.
Yeah.
the word hints there is probably. I think it may be a good word in that it's not saying this eerie image of children on Halloween shows the racial tension. You know, it is stepping back a little bit. Hints is a good thinking about. This is back to my thing about active voice. When you have active voice, it means that somebody or something is doing something. And so this is sort of suggesting that this image is doing something. And what's it doing it to? It's at you somehow. It's hinting to you. That I rather like.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like the second half of it because it breaks down how they came to that conclusion. So if you're someone who's more of a novice art viewer, this would be like an effective way of teaching you like what effects the photographer's doing. Because you might look at this and be like, okay, why is this picture in the art museum? And it kind of guides you through like some of the choices that the artist made and like doing tight cropping and like the expressions on the face. So it kind of guides your eye through reading the picture and kind of picking up on those ideas of like why it feels eerie.
One of the
Maybe
things
it's just the word eerie though that's bothering me. Because does it need that word?
I like that
I
word.
can't see it.
If we could see the picture,
I don't
it's
have
like,
I don't have a closer
It's
picture
true.
up of, I don't have a picture, but I think it's fair. I mean, one of the things that especially art museum folks worry about is they want you to look at the image. They want you to look at the painting and the artwork, but they also want to teach you how to look at it. And so this is pretty good, I think, it's about saying particular things to look at in the picture. So I'm supposed to look at their expression. I'm supposed to look at the masked and the unmasked. And that's sort of helps me go back to the object. Yep.
It's full of grad school words. It's not an accessible level at all. There's like, I can see like 4 or 5 words in there that are...
Right. Now it's at the Jewish Museum in New York, which is a very sophisticated audience.
But it's,
So
right, but it's kind of a chicken and egg. The reason that the art seems being elite is because it uses language like this, it uses language like this, and that's okay because it's elite. So it kind of
the words
it locks itself in its own
Okay.
like elitism.
So you wouldn't put this at the disabled museum. And the words that you don't like are what words?
Juxtaposition.
I think hints. I think juxtaposition. I think close cropping or tight cropping. The fact that it's close juxtaposition. The effect is heightened, maybe. I don't know. It's just it's a particular type of language.
Yeah. No. Again, it's at a museum that maybe has a better case to be made for this.
My question is actually more, I like eerie, I like those words that are more evocative, but for me it's broken in the second sentence when it says the effect is heightened because it's passive voice. So I wonder if you're supposed to include the artist and say, Newman heightens this tension through or something, like to make it more active in that way.
But then it becomes, then you defeat the whole purpose of hint, because then it says he definitively did this.
Or you could just say the tight cropping. You could leave out the effect is heightened by, say, the tight cropping, the anxious expression, and the close juxtaposition heightens
Yeah, that's better.
this feel. Although I think
that
it's
you want to
worth
keep
calling
it.
attention to the close cropping. It's this sort of thing that, in fact, you don't. If you're not an expert viewer of these things, that actually does make a real difference in how that's what the artist did.
But is there a way of communicating that without using tight cropping, which is sort of jargon?
It is jargon. Again.
Maybe like the zoom in.
Yeah.
I was just thinking that I actually don't agree with something that was said about it suggests too much or interprets too much, because I think that's the nature of art museums, at least the ones that I've been to, where it's this is a Baroque painting and you talk about things that go along with Baroqueness or whatever, and you're not going to assume this is an interesting tension between assuming that the people who are looking at it know something such as tight cropping, but also that they don't necessarily maybe they don't know that these elements together work to make eeriness, and so I think this is actually a pretty typical thing, and not that typical things are necessarily just okay, let's do it, but I think that I'm wondering if the racial tensions part is not what it is, when people say I don't know if I'll get this out of that, I don't know if that's the contention or if it's the idea that you interpret an art piece for an audience is the idea, and I think that's 2 different things.
So this is not trying to teach art history particularly. It's not teaching about photography in the 1950s.
I think we would know more if we knew kind of the context it was in. And I think that curators are always telling a story by having objects converse with one another, and it's okay for them to have an opinion about something, and maybe not all viewers understand that a choice has been made in how this art piece is being shown and displayed and the conversations it's having with other pieces. And perhaps you don't want to dumb down your language too much because you know that part of your audience is going to be an art expert who wants to see authentic photography terms like tight cropping, and if you're worried about capturing that other audience, you could have some sort of maybe a hands-on activity that kind of demonstrates use these L's, here's a photo from the exhibit, play with changing the size of it, this is called cropping, and that could be a moment where you can teach that in a way but still kind of make it tie in for all those audiences.
The thing that I would take away from this is that somebody's thought a lot about what to look at here and what it means, and I think this does a pretty good job of getting that across. Now, whether it's the right message or not, it depends on the show. The language, though, this is sort of tense language that fits the piece of art. Let's do one more. And so this is, I'm actually not sure what this one is, but it's an exhibit about Chinese, about communist China. Just you can see the context there a little bit more. And I've just blown up the text here so you can read it better.
Oh my god.
Has an impact, doesn't it? So, choice of details.
Well, it
is-
certainly like hits you.
So the thing about this is that it really, presumably in her 20 years in jail, you could go on at great length about how horrible it was. Picking this last detail in particular, it just sort of sums up a whole system. What else? The style is actually very appropriate. It's sort of just the facts, dates of arrests, prison terms, charges, crime.
And the fact that they put crime in quotes.
Yeah.
Right. And I assume this is the case with these are all individuals, and they're all, my guess is this part is all, this part here is all similar. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that they chose to use the word crime and still put it in quotes because they could have said charge.
Right.
Oh, they do say charge.
And I don't know what the difference
Like
is actually.
You could put it, like, I feel like you could have done that without, I feel like they didn't have to actively say, like, this is their crime, but it's not really a crime.
Right.
Because that's what
Okay, the
quote
scared
is
quotes,
very-
right, you should always be a little bit suspicious of sort of scared quotes and
Yeah.
something else, yeah.
I think it's good to see how someone has used two languages on a label, because it reads really easily, actually. Like you've got the I'm presuming that's
Yeah.
Chinese on the left and English on the right, and then it's kind of mixed in on the top, so it feels like it fits well.
The colors in general, this whole space sort of, it's a little bit scary. That is not a place to pleasantly relax. This is full of closely cropped, if I can say that, pictures of people, that were in jail staring out at you.
Oh yeah, it's very disconcerting going to your comment.
The photo though is so colorful. Like the other ones, it looks like are black and white and more like prison shots. That one is sort of like a sweet shot of a sweet girl with pink cheeks.
Which is, I'm
Colorized.
sure, is
It's kind of odd.
I'm sure that's not an accident though, because it juxtaposes like her innocence against this story about her, which is the opposite of that.
It's very jarring. Even like reading the label, like I found myself like scanning the first part because it's like details, and then I heard like in her own blood, and I was like, whoa.
What if you had
that
taken,
dash is really effective.
what if you had taken this last sentence, the last phrase, and put it at the beginning? Stronger, not so strong?
So that would make it weaker.
I
I
like
think
at
the
the
whole
end.
point is that it builds,
Yeah.
and so if you start with that, I don't know.
It's like the final offense.
So the first, so let's say you stop it right there. That's basically the facts of what she did. The rest of it is just to sear this into your mind of, not about her, this is about the guards.
The system.
The main thing that strikes me here is that it really is, somebody thought really hard about what details to pick. It's really, you don't forget that one.
Kind of feels like the opposite of the press release or the letter the editor did a few weeks ago, where the first sentence is the key thing and people won't read past that, whereas the impact is in the final sentence.
Yeah.
This is real short. This is maybe 75 words, so people will read it.
It's engaging though, and on the side, like where it says "kill the chicken to scare the monkey," that's to me that's really like that draws me in. I'm like, what are they talking about? What does that mean? Yeah,
So
I like that.
These are short sentences. They're all active. So landed her in jail. She wrote, refused. She wrote, she was executed. The last one, of course. Yeah.
The last two words, kill her, makes you want to read the whole thing.
Yeah.
If you zone in on the last two words.
You have to read to the end though to get to the active stuff.
Right.
It doesn't kind of.
Well, that's
It's not like the
memorable
active
part.
first sentence kind of thing.
Even
It's
if you're
a
scanning, like that
passive
visual
sentence.
dash, I think does a lot. And suddenly you see like in her own blood, and you're like, whoa, something is happening here.
There is
Yeah.
something a little. I don't love how they start with that clause, once an ardent communist.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand why it's good to kind of set up the rest of the story, but it's still. It doesn't. hit you right away with anything.
In
Yeah, I
general,
agree.
you want to be really careful about that kind of, that's not that exciting a thing to read. So I will, on the notes that I post, the website where all of these are is listed. It's worth looking at that. And there's nice examples and nice analysis of what works and what doesn't work. Main thing to remember is short, active. Fact, interesting details. That's what makes things work. All right, so remember Friday in the library.